So welcome to Transform Gov, the digital government podcast, and I'm your host, Maeve Neefsey. So Transform Gov is part of the Ireland eGovernment Awards, and it's proudly brought to you in association with Accenture. So each episode we uncover how digital is reshaping public services, and we explore the very groundbreaking work that's changing how government is serving the citizen. So this interview is part 2 of a fascinating interview with Martin Quigley, who's director of the data and analytics area within Pobal, and also winner of the Ireland eGovernment Awards for the general category for their work on the HP Deprivation Index. So we decided to do 2. It was a bit impromptu, so we managed to put the whole studio on pressure. But anyway, and the reason is we really only kind of touched the surface of what's been going on within Pobal and the impact that it can have on so many different departments that you work with. And we talked about the Deprivation Index, which basically is an ability to assess areas within the country that need extra resources because of deprivation. But there's far more than that we talked about. And so we just decided to continue the conversation. So please don't miss part 1. It's fascinating, particularly if you are going on any sort of mission when it comes to data. I think Martin's going to give you a huge amount of insight. But I think one thing I did learn about Martin when we got prepared for the interview is that he really has a huge passion. So Martin, thank you for coming back, by the way.
No problem.
And I suppose I was wondering what kind of advice you might give somebody else, a colleague in the public sector who's maybe starting out on this journey, I suppose, in terms of data governance, because it's the bedrock really of whatever you do next is that your data is correctly organised, clean, treated, managed, and then obviously providing open access to that data.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'll speak to 2 pieces slightly separately then in terms of data governance and open data. I'd say it's fair to say that certainly in Pobal we're still on our journey around data governance. I'd say it's fair to say that we intentionally began by making a very pretty outside of the house and making it look making it look appealing rather than necessarily beginning with the foundations. And we did that intentionally.
What you call early wins type thing? Or
quick wins, demonstrating value. I would have mentioned to you in the first of the podcasts, the approach that we typically would have had around taking a piece of a requirement as an analysis project rather than necessarily the development of a data product. And those are 2 quite different things. And I think as we've scaled up, and I suppose if I was to go back to myself a number of years ago, the advice I would be giving myself is not to miss the opportunities in terms of looking at those foundations. Because yes, the quick wins are really important. They do bring people along. They demonstrate value. But it is also really important to make sure that that we're closing the loop as we identify data quality issues. We don't just resolve them; we solve the.
How do they get to the state they're in the first place? Yeah.
We put in place the processes and the procedures to ensure that we don't accrue more data quality issues going forward. And I think it's true across the public sector that very often the pace and the urgency means that we're looking at the thing in front of us and we're looking at the deadline, and the time for that lessons learned, the time for that review of the policy that allowed those data quality issues or whatever the case may be to get there in the first place, there isn't always time for that. So that's I suppose in particular what we're looking to focus on.
Don't put it on the long finger if you can.
Is not to put it on the long finger if at all you can. That said, there's also huge value in the quick wins in terms of high visibility, high value data projects. A good example of that would be we would have worked with with the Health Research Board a couple of years ago, utilising, they have really rich data on access to drug treatment. So the NDTRS, National Drug Treatment Reporting System. We would have worked with Dr. Susie Lyons and Brian in the HRB to utilise that data, join it with the deprivation index. We were able to, in relatively short time frame, or at least relatively low resource input into the project, we're able to create some quite high value pieces of research that we were able to put out there in terms of the very strong relationship between deprivation and drug use, as you might imagine. I think the 14% of the most disadvantaged areas in the country account for 42% of drug treatment episodes. So as I don't think anybody would be surprised by, but we were able to both generate those findings as well as demonstrate the value of our two data sets, and do that without the need to really consider the underpinning data governance. Of course, the more we want to update and refresh and put in place put in place processes where maybe you have nice ongoing automatically updated dashboards, of course then there can't be a data cleaning step every time. There needs to be standards around, well, all of that good stuff on data governance of who owns the data, what does the process look like, who's undertaking the cleaning, who's running the tests to make sure that it's sufficiently good quality, all of that stuff.
Yeah, I found that having done lots of projects where there's an awful lot of data involved, that's a piece people really hate and they resist.
It can be,
I mean, maybe that's just maybe it's just, look, we know we don't like stacking the dishwasher, but we have to do it anyway. How do you? It's
eating the greens.
Any ways of trying to make people be less resistant and just say, look, we have to do it?
So I suppose what we have found is doing those analysis projects up front that demonstrate the value and say, look, this is okay. So I suppose one of the key things I think is a lot of the systems that in the civil service or the public sector that we're using, the data sets that we have, are not data sets that were generated to answer policy questions. They're data sets that were generated to administer programs, to do things. They're data sets we have by virtue of administering a taxation system. They're data sets we have by virtue of administering a social welfare system. These are the core data sets of administrative data we have. And likewise, we're quite similar in terms of, say, the early years data that we have. The purpose of it is so that parents can access subvention and services can get paid. However, the work of my team then is to interpret that data in a way that answers very particular policy questions. And I suppose that's where some of the challenges can arise. But I think it's also where you try to hook in there in terms of, well, let's also make sure that everybody along the chain who's entering information into the system, who's working with the system, say in an operational basis, they understand that it's also going to be used to answer very important policy questions.
So in other words, they're not just a cog in the wheel.
They're not just a cog in the wheel.
They understand the bigger picture.
An administrator or somebody working in a call centre who's entering information into our IT system, understanding that, yes, the information they're entering in will help this individual case be processed accurately, but also these figures are going to feed into nationally our understanding of, is there enough childcare places? Our understanding of what's actually happening in the sector and making sure that we can properly evidence-base our information. So I would say one of the pieces to that is understanding everybody who's interfacing with the system and trying to ensure that they also understand that it's not just an administrative system, it's actually the key national data set that informs future policy.
Yeah.
And that can be, can be quite important.
Yeah. Yeah. So in other words, they can understand the implications of why they're doing it in the first place.
Yeah.
And in terms of the changes, I know that Pobal Maps is a very important part of what you did within the Deprivation Index. Yeah. Yes. Firstly, tell us a little bit about that, but also I think you, in your submission, you mentioned that it really built public trust in the index. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we would get, I don't have the up-to-date figures, but I think it's in the region of sort of 500,000 hits we've had over the last 12 months on the updated Pobal Maps. So every 5 years, the Deprivation Index will be refreshed using the latest census data. And we also use that as an opportunity back when we launched the most recent Deprivation Index in November 23. We use that as an opportunity to update the software that we publish it on. So on Pobal Maps, we would have worked with colleagues in Compass Informatics who develop Pobal Maps for us. And we work very closely with them in partnership for a number of years. So they have developed the updated Pobal Maps, and we looked at.
I'm sorry, who are they? What do they do?
So they're a company that provides GIS, so Geographic Information System solutions, and we work with a number of public sector clients such as ourselves. So we looked at a number of the most common use cases and tried, and would have worked with a number of, say, local authorities and city and county childcare committees, various users of the index, trying to understand what were some of the most common use cases. So a good example, we would have received a lot of queries previously for, can you generate a bespoke deprivation score, or can you give us a profile for this very particular geographic unit? because of course, we try to present everything by small area, electoral division, local electoral area, municipal district, etc., etc., etc. But there'll always be very bespoke geographic units. The guards have their divisions. The health service, are coming up with 6 new regional areas now in Staunch Care. There's always going to be these new bespoke geographic areas. So a very common a very common request to us, which is, can you provide a profile of your information by this particular unit? So one of the things that we were able to create on Pobal Maps was basically go in, select as many small areas as you want, use a lasso tool, draw a circle, select them one by one, and that will create you a bespoke dashboard of information about that bespoke area that you've created on the fly.
Really engage the public.
So that was one of the, I'd say a lot of users such as local authorities, politicians, councillors, etc. would use. Probably the one that would be most commonly accessed by the general public would just be the deprivation maps themselves. 2 things, the deprivation maps themselves and the comparison tool. So we have a nice little slider tool that allows us to see on one side 2016 and another's 2022.
Yes.
And you can slide across and
it's
see
very
as the
easy
area.
to use. I mean, I've gone and used it. It's incredibly easy to use.
We hadn't intended to publish it. It was a QA tool that Compass gave us 2 weeks before launch to say, can you just make sure this all makes sense compared to how it looked last year, 5 years ago? So an internal quality assessment tool that we were given, and we kind of looked at it and said, we have to publish this.
Absolutely.
This is cool.
Yeah.
So they were very, very good in terms of quickly adapting to our emerging requirements. And so when we launched, we launched that as one of the key pieces, because it really allows you to visually see, has an area more red, which is more disadvantage, or more blue, more affluence over that 5-year shift. So that was one of the things.
And I presume, in the future, you'll be able to, if you're using a common index like this, be able to compare what's happened when there has been additional resources put into, let's say, early intervention childcare. It hasn't changed from red to blue.
Yes.
Ultimately to be able to prove the impacts.
We can. We certainly can, and that is one of the uses of the index, is looking at change over time. It's probably fair to say that there's also some challenges to looking at it that way, by virtue of the fact that many of the interventions and services that are provided to individuals in disadvantaged communities are provided at the individual level. So education and employment supports, the great enablers of social mobility, often provided to individuals or households at the individual or household level. And very often what happens over time is that those people may move out of that area. And the people who are going to be moving in are maybe more likely to share the socioeconomic characteristics of theirs who are already
rather
there.
than area
so often
change.
You see individual change at a greater speed than you see geographic change. So, we do see very long-term geographic entrenchment of deprivation, that you don't necessarily, that isn't as bad as, I suppose it might look if you're to consider the individuals and the supports that were provided at the individual level. Definitely, I would say from a program measurement and impact measurement perspective, the index is, it can certainly be used.
And in terms of open data, so you're providing, can anybody in the public go in and look at the data? Can anybody actually integrate the data, pull the data out? Let's say, for example, I'm making something up. You had a whole load of programmers who you wanted to create interesting data sets, see how they use the information. Is that all possible?
Yeah. And I suppose I'd wear 2 hats here. So I suppose in addition to my role in Pobal, I'm also a member of the Open Data Governance Board with the Department of Public Expenditure. So you can speak to open data maybe in a broader sense if you wish. From the perspective of the Pobal Maps and Pobal Deprivation Index, yes, we make everything publicly available at electoral division area level. And that's available on data.gov.ie, or it's available on Pobal Maps. It's available then to any government department or academic on license. So they would have to come to either ourselves in Pobal or Professor Jonathan Pratchka, who provide then the index at the most granular level. But I suppose
who's Jonathan Pratchka?
So the index was originally authored by Jonathan and a gentleman named Trutz Haas. Trutz passed away a number of years ago. So Jonathan continues to be the author of the index and creates it for us every 5 years.
Okay, and is he based here? Is he part of the state government or?
No, so he's largely based over in Italy.
Okay. So have you had, hackathons where you've had people come in and actually go into the data and try and see if they can come up with insightful ways of using the data?
We haven't done hackathons directly with the deprivation index. It's a good idea. We've certainly done a little bit of that just even within our team, looking at different areas. But it's certainly, it's available at electoral division area on data.gov.ie, and it is there for anybody to play with and compare with other information. I know, for example, somebody that I know did download our data set and downloaded data on Dublin bikes and was able to see, is there a skew between Dublin bikes being located in more affluent or more disadvantaged areas?
Oh, we should definitely we can get the Adapt Centre, get Eurodata and get a group of young people or whatever. It doesn't have to be young people. People who are interested in the data, try and see what they can get out from it. Because it also can be interesting. Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. Okay, so future. Let's talk about the future before we finish up. What are you hoping for in terms of Pobal and what you'd like to see happen within the organisation? Yeah. Because I do feel from our whole conversation, you're on a journey. I know that's such a pun and we're not really doing the X factor or whatever it is, but you're in the middle of something. Yeah. What do you hope and what are your visions for use of data within Pobal and obviously the cross policy?
Yeah. So I suppose we've spoken a lot about the deprivation index. I think one of the key things that we're going to be keeping a close eye on is the developments of the CSO in terms of the census. I mean, there's certainly going to be a census in 27, and I understand in 32. The future from then on is maybe less clear in terms of what that census will look like. I know they're looking at administrative data, potentially moving to a different cycle. So whatever happens there, we'll be keen to work closely with the CSO in terms of keeping the deprivation index updated at least at its current frequency, and if we can do it more frequently, then that's fantastic. We continue to work with a range of departments around say using the index for resource allocation, and as I've mentioned, a number of our sort of, I suppose our toolbox in terms of how that can support different policies continues to increase. And I suspect that will be only more be the case now as we're looking at technologies such as generative AI and things like this that can really sort of supercharge and superpower some of the work that we've done there, potentially remove some of the more manual elements of what we're having to do to do that work.
By using generative AI?
So we can't really come on a podcast about digital transformation and not talk a little bit about generative AI. We're currently trialing it in a number of ways within the organisation. I'd say we're at the stage where we're looking at small productivity gains on that distribution. The early adopters are really embracing it. I think we'll need to look at supports and training for the majority of the organisation to ensure that we're leveraging the technology. It's still maturing, and I'd still be in the place of thinking that, even if we're not finding these, high-value tentpole use cases, bringing along the organisation in a way that we're going to be ready for whatever is coming next, and having a workforce that is embracing of the technology and understands the basics of prompt engineering, all of these things, I think is a really important foundation for whatever is going to come next in terms of generative AI. So that's one element, and then we're also looking at because I haven't spoken much about Pobal's role in terms of ICT development, but that's also an area that we're looking at in terms of how can generative AI, and in particular things like large language models, support some of the work there around translating program requirements into business requirements, translating those business requirements into functional requirements, translating those into technical specs, translating that into
the actual process.
Emphasizing the word translating, because LLMs don't do a lot of things well, but they translate pretty well. Yeah. So some of those steps we're looking at other ways to generate efficiencies there. Yeah,
internal efficiencies particularly, right?
Yeah.
Look, it's been absolutely fascinating, Martin. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights. And I'm dying to find out what Pobal does next. I hope you've got another entry that you can enter next year.
Yes.
Good. Yeah. Good. Excellent. And we're going to be opening up the entries fairly soon, believe it or not. And on top of that, it would be great if there was more use of the data for different uses. The open data, it's there for people to do, and I know you're a big advocate of that. So best of luck with the future.
Yeah, and just if anybody does want to go on, have a look, play with the data. It's there on data.pobal.ie. You can access it in map view, or for any, in particular in this podcast, I'm sure there's plenty of people who will want to just download the data set itself. So it's there on data.gov.ie. And for anybody in particular, anybody in government who does want access to the actual small area data, or even would just like to sit down with myself and some of our data science people around, could it fit a particular policy agenda item? Look, Quigley at pobal.ie, really happy to take those emails and calls.
That's fantastic. Really good. Well, thank you so much, Martin. And a big thank you again. And also thank you to our team, because I've definitely messed up their day by doing 2 recordings because it was so interesting. So our producer, Conal O'Moran, our studio manager, Peter Rice, video editor, Neil Horner, sound engineer and videographer, Lee Brennan. And finally, thank you to South Dublin Podcast Studios. Thank you.